Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired justice of the New York State Supreme Court. My client Joe was arrested, and he was arrested for bookmaking, and he was an older guy, and he was ignorant of the warnings that the detectives had given him. At the time, he was taking action right outside an off-track betting office that the state was running, and he was warned by the police. The detectives told him, get away from there and stop infringing on the state's business. But, of course, he offered credit, so the bettors were showing up there, and anybody that needed credit couldn't go to OTB and get credit, but they would go to Joe, and he had a nice business going there, and he would square up every week with his customers rather than on the spot, as OTB did. So, out of spite for his ignoring the warnings that they had given him, the detectives arrested him, and they made sure it was on a Friday night. And what's the significance of Friday night? Well, Friday night, the whole criminal court system is bustling with arrests. People are getting, they got paid, and people get to drink and celebrate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very busy time. And there's, on the weekends, there's a smaller crew in the court system, which means if you're arrested on Friday night in Brooklyn or Queens or Manhattan or the Bronx, you're probably not going to see an arraignment or a judge until Monday. And so the detectives were mindful of that, and they did it on purpose because he kept ignoring their warnings. They were nice enough to warn him, and he was obstinate enough to ignore their warnings. I guess the profit motive was very strong. So he spent a long weekend in jail, and on Monday, it was time for his arraignment, and an arraignment is when the judge reads the charges against the guy, and eventually his case came up on the calendar, and I was there, and we had to appear before Judge Katz. Now, there were two Judge Katz with that name in Brooklyn at the time. One of them was female, and one of them was male. And the female Katz, the court officers and court personnel would differentiate between the two, referring to the female Judge Katz as cats with balls, as opposed to the male who had none. And but she was highly respected. She was a good gal and a good judge, but she was no fool, and she was her own person. She wasn't following the book necessarily. She was very, very good and had a good sense of discretion. She was streetwise, in other words. Well, we entered the obligatory not guilty plea, and the judge said, well, do you want to be heard on the question of bail? She said, and I can't, you want to be heard? She said, this guy has a long record, this guy has a long record. She said, including bank robbery and kidnapping. She said, what do you want to say? I said, well, Judge, let's understand, I think we can both agree that the sole purpose of bail is to ensure the fact that the defendant would return to court. Now, my client is in his mid-60s at this point in his life. And in his 20s, as a young man, he committed a serious indiscretion. He went to California and he robbed a bank. It was armed robbery, and he was convicted. And because he came from New York and robbed a bank in California, the authorities there decided to prosecute him also for kidnapping. And that gives into the kidnapping. He held people at gunpoint, and he didn't do anything else except that. And they just added kidnapping as icing on the cake as a deterrent to people from out of state who wanted to come to California and commit crimes. Well, the fact is, he paid his dues. He did 8 years in jail in his 20s. And, of course, bank robbery and kidnapping is no joke, but 8 years in jail is no joke either. And he served his time. After that point, it's been a different story for the rest of his life. He became a bookmaker. And he came back to New York, and he made a living gambling and making book. And there's no violence on his record. You look, after that one incident in California, there's no violence. He's no threat to society in that regard. And now here he is some 40 years later, and that's still true. And as you said, and quite correctly, he has many arrests. I mean, there's over a dozen arrests. But his long record has not one warrant for failure to appear. He shows up, he shows up, he shows up, he shows up. Enough already, she said, I got it. He shows up. I said, yes, Judge, he shows up. And you're looking and you're holding documentary evidence of the fact that this guy comes to court. And that's all we're really concerned with here. Comes to court. By the way, let me say something else. and make the court aware of what just transpired back in the holding pens behind this courtroom where my client was held. There's a young man that was there in the pens with my client. And the young guy is he's a Puerto Rican kid. I think he's a late teenager or early 20s. And he's a heroin addict, and he's going cold turkey back there. And he's shaking like a leaf. He's shivering. My client took off his sweater and gave it to that young man to help him keep warm. And noticing the fact that the young man had holes in his shoes and my client realizing that he was about to get out and go back out on the street, gave up his shoes and traded shoes with the young man so that he'd have a decent pair of shoes without holes in them. Well, that's the guy you're looking at, and he helped that poor guy. So I'm asking the court, all things considered, to ROR, release my client in his own recognizance with no bail, because he comes to court and because he happens to be a very decent human being. The judge looked up and she said, you're right. I'm going to release him in his own recognizance, and I'll tell you what. He's been in jail since Friday night. If he pleads guilty to the charge, a misdemeanor, there'll be no bail, and there'll be time served. He won't have to serve any more time. He won't have to come back. He'll pay a small fine in the form of an administrative fee, and that'll be the end of it. Well, she was smiling, I was smiling, and Joe, my client, was smiling. It was a happy ending. The point of all of this is simple, and sometimes the accused criminal is the best person in the courtroom. Look at the record, yes, but read what it says, and read what it really says, and what it tells you. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.